Upon discovering June's pregnancy, her father made no inquiries about the father. Instead, he unceremoniously drove her into the desolate wilderness and surrendered her as if she were chattel. The man to whom he delivered her was not at all what one might have anticipated. He remained largely silent, gesturing towards the cabin's entrance before retreating to his shed, treating her no differently than the sack of feed her father had also presented him with. June stood frozen, the rope burns on her wrist still tender, her eyes swollen from a blow she hadn't foreseen. Her father had offered no parting words, only a guttural sound before riding off down the mountain path, never once looking back. She was a mere 17 years old, barefoot in the snow, her belly beginning to swell, now abandoned in the middle of nowhere, with a man twice her size who had not uttered a single syllable. The cabin door creaked inward, a wave of warmth washing over her face. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the wooden floor. A cot stood in one corner, accompanied by a rough table, a wash basin, and hooks on the wall adorned with furs, a shotgun resting on the mantelpiece. When she finally turned, he was no longer there. June stepped inside cautiously, the wind, not his will, closing the door behind her. She collapsed near the hearth, wrapping her arms tightly around her midsection. Her father had never once inquired about the father, nor had he sought any explanation. He had simply barged into her room, hauled her out by her hair, and thrust her into the wagon. "This is your burden," he had snarled. "You will bear it or perish with it. I will not have your transgression corrupting this home." Then came the arduous journey, hours without sustenance or rest, only the relentless snow and profound silence, the echo of her own heart shattering in her ears. Now the only sound of breaking was the firewood in the hearth. Soon after, the distinct sound of heavy boots echoed from the porch. She remained motionless. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, appearing even taller than she recalled, his broad shoulders draped in wolf pelts, a thick beard obscuring his face, and dark, unreadable eyes. He cast a single fleeting glance in her direction before walking to the fireplace, dropping 2 rabbits and commencing to skin them without a word. She watched him, her gaze unwavering. He did not return her look. Finally, her voice emerged, raspy and uncertain. "What is your name?" He continued his task, not looking up. "Rook," he replied, a simple, flat utterance. Silence descended once more, heavy and unnerving. Her fingers trembled in her lap. "What do you require of me?" she inquired, her eyes fixed upon him. He still avoided her gaze, gutting one of the rabbits. "I did not request you," he muttered. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. June felt a familiar sting in her chest, but she suppressed it. She had shed enough tears that morning. She would not grant him any more now. That night she lay down on the floor beside the warmth of the fire. He had not offered the cot, and she dared not claim it. Her hands cradled her growing belly. She hadn't confided in anyone yet, but she could already feel it. The faint, internal stirring, a sensation unrelated to hunger or fear. The nascent life within her, the sole possession she had left. The subsequent days unfolded in a profound silence. Rook departed before dawn and returned well after dusk, invariably bringing game or firewood, often both. She never witnessed his comings or goings, only the sharp report of an axe meeting wood, the distant crack of a firearm, and the startled flight of birds. He never laid a hand on her, posed no questions, and rarely even met her gaze. June occupied herself with domestic chores, lacking any other purpose. She managed to prepare meagre meals, though her hands fumbled due to her inexperience. Her father had forbidden her from approaching the hearth, asserting it was her mother's domain until the day of her passing. It was on the 5th morning that she discovered the blood. It had seeped through the front of her dress by the time she awoke. Her scream drew him in from outside, snow clinging to his shoulders, an axe still in his hand. "I'm bleeding," she whispered, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "It's too early. I can't. I don't know." He moved with swift urgency, setting the axe aside, approaching her, glancing at her once, then lifting her into his arms and carrying her to the cot without seeking her consent. She lay there, trembling, repeating the plea, "Please, not the baby! Please, not the baby! Please, not the baby!" Rook remained silent, but he diligently stoked the fire to a roaring heat, then boiled water and gathered every available pelt from the cabin to cover her. She observed his hands tremble, a fleeting tremor, as he wrapped her legs and assessed the bleeding. Hours elapsed. The bleeding subsided and the cramping ceased. She had not lost the child. That night he sat beside her on the floor, his back against the wall, his gaze fixed on the fire, his expression inscrutable. "You cared," she whispered. He did not acknowledge her observation. "Do not flatter yourself." Yet his voice faltered as he spoke. She offered no further words, content to listen to the crackle of the burning logs and the quiet, steady breathing of the man who had not once offered a smile since her arrival, but had carried her as if she were something fragile. By the second week, subtle changes began to manifest. A second bowl was placed alongside his at mealtimes, even without an explicit offer. A blanket, new and clean but untouched, was neatly folded near the hearth, evidently intended for her. Her boots, their soles meticulously stitched and repaired, were mended without her request. He was not cruel, nor was he kind. He was something else entirely, something beyond her comprehension. Then the tempest descended. It raged down from the mountains like a ravenous beast, confining them to the cabin for 5 consecutive days. The wind shrieked, and snowdrifts obscured the porch. The fire remained alight, but their provisions dwindled. Their conversations were reduced to mere necessities. "Hand me that pot." "There's a draught by the shutter. Eat this. It's warm." Yet it was on the third night, after she slipped on the ice near the door and landed with a jarring impact, that he finally raised his voice. "What were you thinking, venturing out like that?" She flinched, cradling her elbow. "I needed snow for water. I told you I would fetch it. You were asleep." He retrieved the bandages and moved towards her. She recoiled instinctively. He froze. "I am not your father," he stated, his voice low. She looked up, surprised. He knelt down, his movements gentler now. "You flinch like that only when you anticipate a blow." She remained silent. "I will not strike you," he murmured, "even if you speak out of turn." She studied him for a considerable time before whispering, "You are the first man who has ever said that to me." Rook offered no reply, merely wrapping her arm with his large hand, a gesture of unexpected tenderness. That evening she occupied the cot rather than the floor. He made no objection. As tears streamed silently down her face, a mixture of shame and sorrow, he remained in the darkness, listening without comment. It was during the 6th week that the fever struck. She awoke in a sweat-drenched haze, her teeth chattering, the world spinning precariously. Rook's hand was on her forehead before she could even utter his name. He said nothing, instead bolting to the door, saddling the mule, and vanishing into the blizzard. He was gone for 2 days. Upon his return, his face was weathered by the wind, his lips cracked, his hands nearly black from frostbite, but he carried herbs, bandages, and a warming flask containing an unfamiliar liquid. She drank it and drifted into sleep. When she regained consciousness, the fever had broken. Rook appeared more afflicted than she was, gaunt, his eyes shadowed with concern. "Why did you return?" she whispered. He blinked. She attempted a smile. "You could have let the fever run its course." He did not smile, merely shaking his head once. "I am not your father." These were his only words, yet they sufficed. The spring thaw arrived late, grudgingly descending the mountain as if reluctant to awaken. Mud consumed the path, and ice still clung to the roof. The snows melted, but the pervasive chill lingered, as if unwilling to depart. Rook began spending longer periods away each day, hunting and foraging, carrying increasingly heavy loads, though he spoke little of his endeavors. June's belly continued to grow discreetly, a steady blossoming beneath the worn fabric of her dress. He never mentioned it, nor did he inquire about her progress, but she noticed his sidelong glances, the way his eyes would occasionally fall as she moved too quickly or reached too high. He was aware, he always noticed, even when he feigned ignorance. He still did not smile, not once, but he now heated her bathwater without being asked. He left bread by the hearth in the mornings. He took to carving small objects, primarily animals, and placing them on the windowsill as if they had wandered in by chance. Once she discovered a wooden bird with its wings outstretched as if it had just alighted. He never claimed ownership. June refrained from pressing the issue, but she observed him more intently now, attempting to decipher the reserved nature of the man who had little patience for conversation, but had carried her through her illness, tended her injuries, repaired her boots, and brought back wildflowers wrapped in bark as if by accident. Still, he remained silent, regarding the child growing within her, until the day a stray dog followed him home. The creature was scrawny, half-starved, with a pronounced limp in its hind leg, and eyes reflecting a desperation as sharp as its emaciated ribs. Rook discovered it near his trapline. It had snarled at him once before, collapsing at his feet. He carried it back without a word. It was June who christened it. Tinder, she declared, stroking its matted fur by the fire that evening. Because he caught quickly to the warmth. Rook offered no objection, merely continuing to sharpen his blade with long, deliberate strokes, his back turned to her. However, that night, as the wind whistled coldly through the chimney and the dog whimpered in its sleep, Rook placed another pelt near the hearth. He said nothing, merely nudging it closer. 3 days later, Tinder remained steadfastly by June's side. "I suppose he's decided who he belongs to," she murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears as it settled into her lap. Rook did not reply, but he made no effort to conceal the faint hint of a smile that touched the corner of his mouth. That night, a subtle shift occurred. It began with a question. Rook stood by the window after supper, his gaze fixed on the darkening expanse outside. June sat on the cot, rubbing her back. The silence had stretched for an uncomfortably long duration, and the baby within her was kicking with increasing vigor, as if sensing a change. Then Rook turned. "How far along are you?" he inquired. She blinked in surprise. He never posed questions like this, never looked her directly in the face. She swallowed. 6 months, give or take. He nodded, remaining standing as still as a tree. "Is the father gone?" he asked, his voice slower this time. June's throat tightened. Her gaze dropped to her lap. He wasn't a father, not truly. He was the preacher's son. Rook remained silent. "He promised he would marry me," she continued, her voice growing thinner. "He said he loved me. Every Thursday following our choir practice, we would convene behind the schoolhouse. I harbored the notion that this rendezvous signified something substantial." Her response was a bitter, dismissive laugh. As it transpired, I held less than no importance to him. When I informed him of my predicament, he accused his father, claiming I had intentionally misled him. He posited that I was attempting to ensnare a man devoted to his faith. She raised her gaze. "Do you grasp the consequences of my father's subsequent actions?" Rook's jaw muscles twitched subtly, yet his arms remained relaxed at his sides. "I regret the circumstances," he stated softly. June blinked, inquiring, "For what precisely? For the indignity you endured?" His tone lacked the artificiality of someone attempting to mend a fractured situation. Instead, it conveyed a deep comprehension that the damage was irreversible. She regarded him for a prolonged period. "Then why did you accept me?" He paused. "I was indebted to your father." That admission struck a painful chord. She averted her gaze. "He once saved my life," Raw continued his account. "Years ago, he extricated me from a river into which I had fallen. I was intoxicated and reckless. He never allowed me to forget that act of kindness. Consequently, He presented you with a young woman in return. Her voice faltered, a pregnant one no less. I was unaware of that, Roar admitted. He mentioned he had someone in need of shelter. He described her as challenging. The word echoed within June, a painful resonance. He proceeded. I abstained from making inquiries. I presumed it would simply mean another individual to feed and assist with household chores. Then I observed your countenance, the contusions, the defensive posture of your arms. That indeed was a challenging situation. That was one of abandonment. Silence descended once more, but this time it carried a palpable ache, a heavy settling. That night she dreamt of icy rivers and a man plucking her from the frigid waters, not as a repayment of a debt, but out of an inability to tolerate her perishing. The infant arrived prematurely. It commenced with sharp, constricting pains. June bit down on her lip until it bled, striving to suppress the agony. She was determined not to cry out, not to disturb him. However, her water broke before the advent of dawn, and her body left her no alternative. Rourke was at her bedside in mere moments. He made no inquiry regarding the necessary actions. He simply proceeded with them. He procured boiling water, arranged towels, stoked the fire to a higher intensity, and cleared a space on the floor. His movements suggested experience in assisting with childbirth, yet she knew this was his first such occasion. She was too consumed by the intensity of her labor to question it. The pain was overwhelming, a tempest raging through her very bones. She cried out once, then twice, and subsequently ceased to concern herself with the number of times. Rourke held her hand, allowing her to clench his fingers with crushing force, murmuring words that lacked coherence but provided a strange solace. Almost there. You possess great strength. He is nearly here, she responded with a tearful laugh. How can you be certain it is a boy? I cannot be certain, he replied. It is merely a feeling. However, when the infant emerged, flushed and slick, emitting a primal cry of rage known only to new life, it was not a son. It was a daughter. Miniature, flawless, with a cascade of dark hair and tiny fists clenched like nascent stars. June wept, not from physical pain now, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of completeness. Roer severed the umbilical cord, swaddled the newborn, and presented her as if she were a sacred apparition. He did not smile, but his eyes glistened as he looked upon them both. What name will you bestow upon her? He inquired. June gazed downward. Hope. He inclined his head. She embodies everything I never anticipated experiencing. I looked up at him. I would not have had her without your intervention. He shook his head. You would have persevered. No, she whispered, not in this manner. Rourke offered no reply. Yet that evening, as the infant slept peacefully in June's embrace, he repositioned the cot closer to the hearth, brought a second chair into proximity, and settled beside them. He remained there throughout the night, attuned to the wind's soft murmurs against the windows, listening to Hope's gentle breathing. 3 days later, a measured, deliberate rap echoed from the door. Rourke was in the process of honing his blade. June was carefully swaddling the infant. Both movements ceased abruptly. Who would venture this far? She whispered. He offered no response. Rourke moved towards the door, opening it slowly. A young man stood on the porch, approximately 15 or 16 years of age, with a thin layer of mud adorning his boots. He held his hat clasped in his hands. Sir, he began, do you employ anyone? Yes. The boy's voice wavered. Do you have a young woman here named June? Rourke's hand instinctively tightened near the doorframe. And who is making this inquiry? The boy licked his lips. I am her brother. June surged to her feet so quickly that the chair toppled. What? The boy craned his neck, his eyes widening with recognition as he spotted her. June, they told us you were deceased. June's breath hitched in her throat. She stepped out into the snow barefoot, the infant still cradled in her arms. I don't comprehend," she stammered. The boy took a step closer. "My father informed the town that you had absconded. He declared you had brought shame upon us and had likely perished in the river." He continued, his voice growing softer. "But then Mother fell ill. She revealed the truth to me. She told me where he had taken you." Rourke's jaw was rigidly clenched. "And why have you sought us out now?" he inquired. The boy swallowed. "Because Father has vanished. He departed under the cover of darkness after the sheriff began making inquiries about the preacher's son and some hush money. The town is beginning to question things. The populace is becoming inquisitive. And Mother implored me to locate June. She instructed me to bring her home if it were at all feasible." June shook her head in disbelief. "Home?" She looked down at the infant, then at her current surroundings. She whispered softly, "I am already there." The boy, whose name was Seth, slept curled near the hearth that night, his boots removed, his coat folded beneath his head. He was too apprehensive to request a proper sleeping arrangement, yet too exhausted to protest the meagre comfort offered. Rourke made no attempt to prod him, nor did June. Her mind was awash with a torrent of thoughts, none of which had yet settled. She lay on the cot, hope pressed against her chest, feeling the baby's rhythmic breaths against her ribs, a second nascent heartbeat. Every few minutes she would cast a glance at the boy. He appeared so frail, his fingernails grimy, a tear evident on the elbow of his garment. He had undertaken this journey on foot, alone, through snow that had not yet fully receded. June found it unimaginable how far he must have walked to find her, yet equally unimaginable was the prospect of returning, not to that house, not to that community, not to the world that had so carelessly discarded her. Everything had fundamentally shifted. She now possessed hope. She found solace in the quietude. She had Rourke, and she remained entirely uncertain of her standing with him. Rourke had offered very little in the way of conversation since the boy's arrival. He had reverted to his established routines, cleaning, chopping wood, tending to his traps. However, a palpable tension now resided in his shoulders, a watchful guardedness in his gaze whenever he observed June and Seth, assuming they were not aware. He made no inquiry about her future intentions, yet his silence conveyed a message. The choice lay before her, a constant presence throughout the night, stirring her thoughts like a restless avian creature. Could she contemplate a return? Was it even a safe proposition? What if the community's sentiment had truly shifted against her father? Conversely, what if it had not? What if the rumors concerning the preacher's son had reached unfavorable ears, leading to her being implicated once more? And what of Rourke? He had expressed minimal sentiment regarding the child, yet he remained. He offered his assistance. He had even begun to fashion a crib. She discovered it behind the cabin, incompletely constructed, crafted from pine wood, and imbued with a quiet patience. The man who had previously offered only grunts now prepared her tea when she awoke during the night. His smiles were infrequent, but when they did appear, they lingered in his eyes even after his lips had resumed their usual somber set. She harbored a deep desire not to lose this newfound connection, not to lose him. The following morning, the boy awoke early, rubbing his eyes and surveying his surroundings as if half expecting the previous events to have been a mere fabrication. He sat stiffly at the table while June prepared oats. Hope was nestled securely against her chest, stirring intermittently in her newborn slumber. Seth cleared his throat. "My mother is unwell." June paused her preparations. "What manner of illness afflicts her?" "Her lungs. She is expectorating dark matter. They say she will not survive until summer unless she receives assistance." June turned away from the stove. "And you came here unaccompanied?" He nodded. "I had no alternative. We lack the funds for medical care, and Mother repeatedly insisted she needed to see you once more. She expressed a desire to seek your forgiveness," before he trailed off. June sat down slowly, her heart pounding erratically. The resentment she had nurtured for months attempted to surface, but it was immediately subsumed by a heavier emotion. Perhaps it was sorrow or something more tender, something weary. Why did she not intervene? She inquired softly. When he inflicted harm upon me, when he disposed of me as if I were livestock. She attempted to. I solemnly swear she did, Seth replied, his voice barely audible. But he informed her that if she ever voiced opposition to his actions, he would banish her, just as he did you. And mother, she lacks your fortitude. June's jaw tightened. I was not strong. I was merely fortunate. No, Seth countered. You escaped. Rourke entered at that precise moment, shaking the snow from his shoulders, his arms laden with kindling. He remained silent. He simply placed the wood near the hearth and knelt to tend to the fire. June observed him closely. Did you overhear our conversation? He offered a single nod. She studied his face intently. There was something concealed within the depths of his dark eyes. Not judgment, not expectation. It resembled a bulwark erected long ago, constructed brick by painstaking brick. I am uncertain of the appropriate course of action, she confessed. You are not compelled to make a decision at this moment, Raw responded. However, she felt an undeniable urgency to do so, for in that instant she grasped a profound truth about herself and about the entirety of her experiences since the day her father had unceremoniously placed her onto that wagon as if she were a mere sack of grain. She had not simply endured, she had undergone a transformation. She had become hardened, certainly, but not in the manner he had intended. She was no longer someone else's burden. She was now a mother, and mothers do not flee. That evening, she prepared a small satchel, packing enough garments for a few days. Rourke bestowed upon her one of his coats. It enveloped her, but she accepted it nonetheless. He spoke little as she carefully wrapped Hope in blankets, lingering near the doorway as if awaiting a final, opportune moment. Seth had already saddled one of Rourke's mules. The journey back to the town would necessitate a full day if they maintained a brisk pace, potentially longer, considering the presence of a newborn. I shall not remain for an extended period, June stated quietly, merely long enough to see her, long enough to ascertain the truth. Raw nodded. Do you require anything? She moved closer. I understand. A silent communion passed between them, yet it was not devoid of meaning. It was replete with all that remained unspoken, all that might yet be articulated at a later juncture. Then, just as she prepared to depart, he uttered, You will return. It was neither a plea nor a command. It was an affirmation of commitment. She squeezed his hand. I will. The road presented a more challenging passage than she recalled. Frozen ruts persisted along portions of the track, and the mule struggled under the combined weight of the three of them. June took turns walking to alleviate the strain, cradling Hope close to her chest beneath the generous folds of Rourke's coat. They arrived on the second morning as the sun commenced its ascent, gradually piercing through the clouds. The town had undergone no discernible transformation. Its essence remained unchanged. It still carried the familiar aroma of sawdust and horses, and it still vibrated with that subdued undercurrent of whispers poised to erupt into open discourse. The townsfolk now regarded her with a newfound apprehension, a stark departure from their previous scorn or pity. It was, she surmised, the infant she carried, or perhaps her unexpected reappearance after they had all presumed her lost forever. Regardless, she strode along that unpaved track with her head held high, her younger brother steadfastly beside her, and not a single soul dared to utter an insult. Her mother was fading. The physician had confirmed the grim prognosis. Failing lungs, a raging fever, mere days, perhaps a week, remained. They discovered her frail form folded within her bed, her once vibrant frame sunken deep into the mattress, her eyes filmed over and etched with profound sadness. As June entered the chamber, her mother attempted to sit upright, but her strength failed her. "June," she croaked, her voice a mere rasp. "My child." June settled beside her, gently placing the baby, Hope, into her mother's weakened arms. For a silent moment, the two women simply gazed at one another. "I am so sorry," her mother whispered. "I should have shielded you." Tears welled in June's eyes. "Yes, you should have. I know." And that was the extent of their conversation. Absolution wasn't an overwhelming surge. It was a delicate whisper, a shared breath, a silent understanding passed between mother, daughter, and grandchild. She remained for 3 days, long enough to be present as her mother peacefully surrendered her last breath, long enough to witness the preacher's son apprehended, thanks to Seth, who, emboldened by his sister's return, revealed the truth to the sheriff, long enough to stand before her father's vacant chair and confront the stark reality that he would never grace it again. The weak do not meet their end with bravery, they simply cease to be. As June departed the family home for the final time, she cradled Hope in one arm and walked with Seth at her side. The boy's eyes held a new expression, a blend of admiration and unwavering trust. "What's next?" he inquired. She gazed towards the distant mountains. "I'm returning home." He hesitated. "May I accompany you?" She studied his young, wounded face, seeing a reflection of her own past struggles. "Only if you're ready to put in the effort." A grin spread across his face. They reached their destination 3 days later. The ascent was more arduous than the journey down, but June scarcely noticed. The ache in her legs, the sting in her hands, these were prices she willingly paid. And when the humble cabin came into view, its chimney sending a beacon of smoke into the sky, a profound emotion stirred within her. Rourke stood on the porch, awaiting them. He stepped forward as she dismounted, his gaze moving from her to Seth and then to the swaddled infant. "You returned," he stated. She smiled. "I told you I would." Then, acting on impulse, she placed the baby into his arms. Hope stirred, her gaze lifting to the man with the rugged beard and surprisingly gentle hands. "She's grown heavier," he murmured. "She eats as much as her mother did," June replied with a laugh, and with that the three of them stepped inside. Home doesn't always conform to our expectations. Sometimes it's a mountain dweller marked by numerous scars, a boy burdened by excessive fear in his eyes, and a young woman, once discarded, discovering her inherent worth. Yet it was their home, and its true beginning had just commenced. The cabin had always known solitude. Built by Rourke's hands, it was constructed to withstand the elements, weathered by the cold and rooted in the earth, a testament to his intention that it endure long after his departure. For years, its only sounds were the creak of timber under heavy boots and the soft crackle of a low fire. Now it resonated with an entirely new symphony, movement, voices, the infant's cries in the early dawn, laughter, and the pervasive presence of sorrow. It was peculiar how grief shadowed them, even in this remote sanctuary far from the town's reach. June felt it when her hand paused over her mother's familiar jar in the cupboard, or when she stepped out to collect snow for water and heard Seth's rasping cough in the frigid morning air, his small frame too delicate for the harshness. She saw it when Rourke sat too still by the fire, his gaze fixed on the sleeping baby, his hand resting on the cradle he had crafted as if to anchor himself to it. Grief often lingered at the edges of joy, but June no longer feared it. She understood that its presence signified that something had deeply mattered. They had gradually settled into a semblance of routine. It wasn't effortless or smooth, but it was genuine. Seth applied himself to chores with a quiet intensity, perhaps out of a desire to avoid being sent away, or perhaps because it was the first time he felt truly needed. June cooked, sewed, and held her daughter close whenever possible, often rocking Hope in the cradle that Rourke had meticulously finished during their absence. And Rourke, he was making an effort. He wouldn't articulate it, lacking the words, but June perceived it in the way he stayed near Seth, guiding the boy's grip on an axe without raising his voice. She saw it when he brought back extra rabbits from his traps without a word, or when he carved a small wooden horse and left it on the edge of Seth's bunk unclaimed. He had transformed from a man of grunts into one who expressed kindness through his silence. One night, a fierce storm descended. Snow battered the windows, and the wind howled as if attempting to dismantle the world. June held Hope tightly against her, swaddled in quilts that Rourke had reinforced with oilcloth. Seth had pulled his bunk closer to the hearth, and Rourke sat at the table, methodically sharpening a blade, his eyes frequently drawn to June. She finally broke the quiet. "You used to be alone up here, didn't you?" he asked without looking up. "I still am at times." She nodded. "We aren't going anywhere. I know, but you don't quite believe it yet." He ceased his sharpening. "Have you ever attempted to salvage something that didn't wish to be saved?" June's thoughts turned to her mother, her father, the preacher's son, and even herself. "Yes," she replied. He finally met her gaze. "It doesn't work." "No," she whispered, "but sometimes you try regardless." Hope stirred in her arms. June kissed her forehead. "Do you think she will ever forgive me for bringing her into a world like this?" Rourke rose and walked towards her slowly, as if each step held significance. He knelt beside her, his large hand gently brushing the baby's head, as if he feared breaking her. "She already has," he said softly. The wind raged with increased ferocity outside, but its fury could not penetrate their sanctuary. Spring arrived like a sudden release of fever. One day the air was sharp and bleak. The next it was warm enough to shed sleeves. Snow began to recede in scattered patches, revealing glimpses of damp brown earth beneath, soft and yielding to boots. June carried Hope outside into the sun for the first time, while Rourke watched from the porch, arms crossed, a subtle smile playing beneath his beard. Seth ran ahead, his boots splashing through mud, his laughter echoing, the first genuine laughter since his arrival. It felt as if a thaw had begun within all of them. However, this thaw brought not only warmth but also unsettling sounds. Distant gunfire from the woods, a rider sighted perilously close to the trail leading to their cabin. Rourke tensed like a seasoned hound alert to a scent. Then a knock sounded at the door. It was midday. June was inside, feeding Hope, while Seth was out gathering wood. Rourke opened the door to find an unfamiliar man. He wore a long coat, a shotgun slung across his back, and a badge gleamed on his chest. A marshal, not from their immediate area. "You work around Holden?" the man inquired. Rourke offered no verbal reply, merely stepping aside subtly, a silent affirmation. "The name's Bram," the man continued, removing his hat. "I've travelled from 2 towns over, searching for a young woman. Her name is June." Before Rourke could respond, June emerged from the shadows, cradling Hope, her eyes narrowed. "Why are you looking for me?" The marshal appeared taken aback. "I hadn't anticipated you showing yourself. I assumed you had disappeared." "I'm finished with running," she stated firmly. He nodded. "There's unrest in town. The preacher's son didn't take kindly to his arrest. His father is inciting the populace. Some are baying for retribution, and they're blaming you." June's expression remained unchanged. "They've blamed me before." Rourke's hand subtly clenched at his side. He refrained from reaching for his weapon, but the tension in his shoulders conveyed his intent. "What is it you want from me?" she asked. Bram's gaze shifted between them. "Merely to offer a warning and to relay some additional information. Your younger brother, he's been speaking to people. He's told the entire town what your father did, and people are listening." June blinked in surprise. "Seth, he's no longer a mere boy, Mum. He's fighting like a man." She was unsure how to process this revelation, a complex mix of pride and apprehension settling in her chest. "The town might come for you," Bram stated eventually. "Or they might not. But if they do, I suspect you ought to be prepared." He then tipped his hat, turned, and departed without another word. The ensuing silence was more deafening than any sound. That night, conversation was sparse. Rourke lingered by the door longer than usual, one hand resting on the frame, the other near his rifle. June sat with Hope, holding her more tightly than ever. Seth remained close, his eyes reflecting a sharpness that no child should possess. "Do you think they will come?" June inquired. Rourke didn't offer false reassurance. "Perhaps, and if they do," he looked at her, the gravity in his eyes causing her stomach to churn, "they won't get past me." 2 nights later, the confrontation began. Seth spotted them first. 3 men moving stealthily at the edge of the tree line, confident they remained undetected. June quickly placed Hope into a cradle, murmuring soft prayers as Rourke retrieved the rifle from the mantel. "They won't be satisfied with mere words," he stated. June looked at him, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't have to stay. We can flee." "No," he replied resolutely. "They need to understand that you are no longer vulnerable prey." She stared at him, her hands shaking. "Then I stand with you." He gave a single nod. "Get Seth inside. Keep the infant close." But Seth refused to retreat. The boy stood in the doorway, brandishing a long stick as if it were a weapon, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not hiding," he declared. Rourke regarded him for a moment, then knelt and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are courageous," he said, "but brave individuals recognize the importance of protecting those who cannot defend themselves. Your sister requires you. That baby requires you." Seth bit his lip, then nodded, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. The initial shot rang out, low and sharp, kicking up snow. Rourke returned fire, dropping to one knee, aiming with measured precision. June ducked behind the porch's support beams, her heart pounding against her ribs, her fingers tightly gripping the pistol Rourke had entrusted to her weeks prior. A single man broke cover. Rourke felled him with a shot to the leg. The remaining assailants retreated disoriented. They had not anticipated any form of resistance. They had certainly not anticipated Rourke. Then another figure emerged from the shadows, older, taller, the preacher. June's breath hitched in her throat. "I came here to talk," the man announced. Rourke did not lower his rifle. "You brought weaponry to our discussion. You've brought disgrace to our community," the preacher declared, spitting the words. "You led your own daughter into wickedness." "I led her nowhere," Rourke growled. "She escaped because you tried to bury her alive." The preacher advanced. "That child carries his corruption." Rourke remained unmoved. "Then explain why you are the one covered in mud." The preacher's visage contorted, a furious crimson flushing his cheeks. "You will regret defending her." But before he could utter another syllable, a second voice emerged from the dense foliage. "Leave them in peace." It was Seth. The boy had stealthily departed through the rear, scaled a sturdy tree, and now stood upright on a low-hanging branch, his voice resolute, echoing through the woodland. "She is my sister, and that infant is our kin. If you desire them, you will contend with me first." The preacher faltered. His contingent appeared uneasy, glancing at him for direction. Then a second voice joined Seth's. The marshal, his rifle leveled, rode up behind the retreating adversaries. "This concludes here," Bram stated, "or it culminates with a noose." The preacher froze, then abruptly turned and disappeared into the forest. Later, as the flames subsided and the dwelling was once again secure, June sat beside Rourke, her hand resting on his. "You remained," she observed. "I promised I would," he replied. As she met his gaze, she understood. He was not merely the man who had rescued her, he was the one who would ensure she never faltered again. The forest began to breathe anew, not the shallow, apprehensive gasps it had taken under winter's oppressive weight, but long, vital exhalations. Spring had finally taken firm root. Tiny buds were unfurling on the branches, the earth was yielding beneath their boots, and birds were constructing nests low within the shrubs and hollows. Yet within the confines of the cabin, time seemed to progress at a different pace. Following the confrontation with the preacher and his followers, a sense of calm settled within June. It wasn't tranquility, precisely. She remained wary of peace, but it was a state far quieter than outright dread. Perhaps it was the nascent stages of security, or rather the hard-won realization that peril could materialize, and she possessed the fortitude to endure it, no longer confronting it alone. Hope flourished rapidly, far quicker than June had anticipated. Her tiny limbs kicked against the world with unwavering defiance, her gaze wide and steady, perpetually scanning her surroundings. Rourke had fashioned a plaything for her from a segment of birch wood and aged brass buttons, meticulously smoothed so her delicate hands could grasp it without encountering splinters. June often observed Rourke watching the infant when he believed himself unobserved, as though she were a vision he scarcely deserved to witness. June refrained from inquiring about his thoughts when he looked at her daughter. Perhaps he perceived a future he had never dared to desire. Perhaps he saw the life he might have lived had the war, the profound loss, and the oppressive silence he harbored like an unhealing wound not intervened. However, his gaze towards Hope conveyed that she held more significance than he did himself. For June, that sentiment signified everything. Seth, too, had undergone a transformation. The boy who once hid behind her skirts now walked with an enhanced stature, moving with the subtle intuition of one who had learned from the ancient trees. He and Rourke engaged in hunts together. Not frequently. Rourke still undertook the majority of the endeavours alone, but occasionally he permitted the boy to follow in his wake. And each instance they returned with a rabbit or a squirrel, or even just a recounting of tracks discovered in the mud, Seth's sense of accomplishment swelled a little more. June understood the profound feeling of being overlooked. Witnessing her brother emerge into his own was akin to seeing a piece of herself revitalized. However, the world beyond the cabin had not forgotten them, not yet. One day, a message arrived. It wasn't delivered by horse or rider. It was bound to a stone and flung through the window shortly after dawn. The shattering sound awakened all three of them. Hope began to cry immediately, and June rushed to her, her bare feet padding on the wooden floorboards, her heart pounding. Rourke was already crouched beside the fragmented glass, one hand firmly gripping his rifle, the other reaching for the rock wrapped in parchment. He read the inscription silently, his jaw tightening. Then, without a word, he handed it to June. It was penned in a spidery script. "The child is an abomination. The mother's transgression endures. He who shelters them shall bear accountability for both. We have not forgotten. We are approaching." June folded the note with deliberate slowness. Her hands did not tremble this time. She was finished with trembling. "They still believe they can intimidate us," she stated. "They might not be mistaken," Rourke murmured. She met his gaze. "Not because we are vulnerable," he clarified, "but because we now possess something precious to safeguard." Preparations commenced without delay. Rourke reinforced the snares along the tree line. He instructed Seth on crafting triggers designed to incapacitate a person rather than capture a rabbit. June meticulously boiled additional jars of soup, sealed them, and stowed them away in a root cellar she had excavated by hand. They spoke little about the impending events, yet the unspoken understanding was palpable amongst them. Trouble was stirring once more, initially as subtle as smoke, but it was destined to find them. A week elapsed, then another. Then one morning Rourke returned from the northern trail, a wound bleeding from his shoulder. June rushed to his side, her frantic hands tearing at his sleeve. "A trap," he stated, "and it wasn't one of mine." They had set a snare for him, no longer merely words or threats. Seth assisted her in tending to the wound, his teeth clenched tightly. The boy had developed a ferocity that few had anticipated. However, what truly unnerved June was not his anger, but his profound stillness when danger loomed. Like Rourke, Hope sat nearby, idly chewing the edge of a cloth, observing everything with an acuity that suggested she comprehended more than her years implied. "We cannot wait for them to dictate the timing," June declared that evening. Her hands were stained with blood and pine resin. her voice unwavering. "They wish to provoke us," Rourke responded, "to push us until we retaliate. That is the method of cowards." "Then we must determine our own nature," she countered, her voice low. "Are we to prey or to create problems?" The subsequent morning, June entrusted the infant to Seth's care and accompanied Rourke to the elevated ridge. From that vantage point, the entire valley unfurled before them like a meticulously drawn map. Wisps of smoke curled into the distance. Someone was encamped near the river, close enough to cause a knot of apprehension in her stomach. She crouched beside Rourke. "We did not seek this," she confided. He nodded. "They desire retribution, then we shall deliver it." He turned to face her. She did not flinch, not any longer. The confrontation did not arrive with the blare of trumpets. There were no shouts, no flickering torches piercing the forest canopy. It commenced with an unnerving silence and the distinct snap of a twig. 3 men moved stealthily through the woods, their steps measured, one bearing a lengthy rifle, another a rope, and the third carrying something concealed within burlap that clinked with the sound of bottles. They were unaware that Rourke had been lying in wait since before the first hint of dawn. They did not know that Seth had positioned traps behind their advance. They were ignorant of June's ascent into the tree directly above their heads, a pistol tucked discreetly into her waistband, a knife concealed within her boot. The foremost man stumbled directly into a meticulously concealed snare. He fell hard onto the earth, the wind knocked from his lungs. Before he could utter a cry, Seth was present, his makeshift stick brandished like a drawn sword. "Remain motionless," the boy commanded, and he complied. The second man spun around, glimpsing movement within the trees, and raised his rifle, only for Rourke to emerge from behind a thick stump, leveling his own weapon. "Drop it!" The man offered no resistance. The third individual turned to flee, but June descended from her perch like a hawk making its landing, her boot catching his leg. He tumbled to the ground. As he looked up, she had the pistol aimed precisely between his eyes. "You came for a child," she stated. "Now you will account for yourselves." They bound the men and conducted a thorough search. The bottles contained kerosene. Their intention had been to set the cabin ablaze with hope inside. That was the boundary they had crossed. Bram arrived the following day. The marshal surveyed the bound men with a single glance and offered a nod. "We will escort them," he declared. "They will not be the only ones." "You were aware?" Rourke inquired. Bram sighed, acknowledging that he had received prior indications and delayed his intervention. June regarded him. "They intended to harm a child." He met her gaze. "And you prevented it. That is what matters." The trial proceeded quietly, but the news of the proceedings spread with far greater resonance than any verdict could have achieved. Several individuals associated with the preacher's faction were apprehended. The preacher himself vanished into the night, never to be seen again. June did not engage in celebration. Rourke did not smile, but a sense of profound stillness had settled upon him. That week, Hope took her first wobbly steps, her arms flailing like those of a fledgling bird. June wept watching her. "I believed she would grow up in fear," she whispered. "She will grow up free," Rourke affirmed. They did not return to their former community. There was no necessity for it. Word reached them now, accounts of a town undergoing gradual change, of women conversing about June's ordeal, and men re-examining their deeply held beliefs. Seth elected to remain through the summer, then the autumn, and ultimately indefinitely. And one day, as the air grew warm once more, and the trees were resplendent with lush greenery, Rourke approached June holding something in his hands, a ring meticulously carved from aged walnut wood, smooth and unadorned. "I never envisioned myself proposing," he confessed, "but I cannot refrain from doing so." June smiled. "You already have, Rourke," and she slid it onto her finger as if it had always been destined to reside there. The seasons transitioned, not with abruptness, but with a serene, knowing grace. Spring yielded to summer, summer folded into autumn, and the mountains' colours deepened like the fading of bruises, soft golds, russet reds, and the verdant shadows that lay thick in the hollows. Life, it seemed, no longer demanded a constant struggle for every breath. Yet June never allowed herself to forget the ordeal they had endured to reach this state of quietude. The mountain did not truly belong to them. It was something far older, immense and ever watchful, but in a peculiar way it had claimed them, enveloping them like a protective entity that no human could subvert. The cabin stood resilient. The roof no longer succumbed to leaks. The fissures had been mended. A new window had also been installed. Herc had crafted it himself, utilizing salvaged glass and a frame fashioned from white pine. Every instant June observed sunlight filtering through it and illuminating Hope's tiny feet. She recalled the sound of the old window shattering and resolved that no man would ever again threaten that fragile barrier. Hope was now toddling, moving as swiftly as her small legs could carry her. She possessed Herc's determined brow and June's world-weary eyes. She laughed frequently, but learned to trust slowly. The woodlands did not instill fear in her. She delighted in birds and fungi, and found contentment in crouching low to observe insects scurrying across tree bark. Herc began carving miniature animals for her, small bears, foxes, and a wildcat with exaggerated ears, and she arranged them along the mantelpiece as if they were sentinels guarding her domain. June, in the interim, had discovered a novel capacity, the freedom to inhale without the burden of remorse. She was no longer merely enduring, she was truly experiencing life. Laughter, once a distant echo, now graced her days. Occasionally, lost in her own world, she'd glimpse her reflection in the wash basin and barely recognize the woman gazing back. Her countenance had regained its fullness. The gauntness had vanished. Her eyes, once wide with apprehension, now held a steady calm. Herc, too, had softened in his own manner, not diminished in strength. He still moved with the quiet, unyielding presence of a natural edifice, a boulder in motion. Yet when his gaze fell upon June, his defences seemed to recede. He let his guard down when he cradled Hope's minuscule fingers, and when he sat beside Seth, patiently answering the boy's endless inquiries about every tree and star in the celestial expanse. The ring June wore, the band of walnut he had meticulously shaped, remained perpetually on her finger. It required no precious metal or polish. Fashioned from the very mountain that had sheltered them, its significance far surpassed any gemstone. One afternoon, as the descending sun cast a warm orange hue across the forest canopy, Herc stood sentinel in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, a familiar posture. June joined him, her hand resting gently on his arm. He remained silent, but the quietude was different now, imbued not with the former heaviness, but with a profound sense of reverence. "What is it?" she inquired softly. He paused before speaking. "I once believed there was nothing left for me here," he began, "that I was destined to simply fade into this very mountain." She waited patiently, knowing the wisdom of allowing him to articulate thoughts he rarely shared. "But now," he continued, his eyes still directed towards the distant ridge, "I believe I was being reshaped, slowly hollowed, much like the wood I use for these rings. An object isn't rendered useless simply because it has been cut. It gains strength through its shaping." June tightened her grip on his arm. "You weren't shaped to carry emptiness, Herc. You were shaped to carry us." That evening he held her close. Their breaths mingled beneath the thick fur blanket, and no words were exchanged. None were needed. Winter's arrival was more gradual than the preceding year. Squirrels still scampered beneath the porch, and wild hens still scratched near the root cellar. However, June observed a subtle shift in the avian population. They flew lower, actively seeking sustenance, and the nights cooled with increasing swiftness. She resumed her preparations, gathering herbs, firewood, and preserved goods. Rourke set new traps. Seth, with focused intent, practiced splitting wood. There was a sense of calm deliberation in their actions this time, a stark contrast to the frantic urgency of the previous year. Their uncertainty had evaporated, replaced by a quiet readiness. Then, near the close of October, a rider appeared. Months had elapsed since a stranger had ventured this far up the mountain. June spotted the man before he reached their secluded path. She was gathering berries near the ridge when she noticed the fleeting gleam of a horse's mane moving slowly through the dense woods. She instinctively ducked, her heart pounding, not with outright fear, but with a deeper, more primal instinct for self-preservation. The man was clad in a black coat, worn yet meticulously kept, and his hat was pulled low. His posture was remarkably erect, his bearing far too disciplined for a mere traveller. Silently, her eyes wide with a dawning unease, she retreated to the cabin. Rourke was on the porch, engaged in sanding a railing. A single glance at her face told him everything. "Stranger," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Approaching slowly, appears to be a lawman." He handed Seth the sanding tool and proceeded to retrieve his rifle. June gathered Hope close and moved into the cabin, settling the child near the warmth of the hearth. 15 minutes later, the rider materialized. He dismounted with a quiet grace, showing no hint of arrogance. His boots crunched softly on leaves dusted with frost. Removing his hat, he revealed hair that was touched with grey at the temples and a face etched with lines that spoke not of malice, but of long, weary discernment. "My name is Sheriff Bernard Lyle," he stated. "I mean no trouble." June stepped onto the porch. "Trouble never announces itself as trouble," she replied. Rourke remained behind her, a silent sentinel. "I have come regarding the trial," the sheriff continued. "Preacher Wilkes never faced his charges. He vanished, but his ledger was discovered, containing names, lists, and transactions." Rourke stepped forward. "What sort of transactions?" The sheriff hesitated. "He sold girls to men outside the county. Some were bartered away by their own families." A chill spread through June. "Some," the sheriff elaborated, "were not sent alone. There are notations. One girl in particular is listed with her brother. It aligns with your account. That ledger implicates her father. We are preparing to make arrests." June felt her knees weaken. "You mean to tell me?" Rourke interjected, his voice a low growl. "You are only addressing this now?" The sheriff's gaze was honest, though heavy with weariness. "I am here because I intend to do what is right. However, I require her testimony." "No," June stated immediately. "I will protect you." "You were not there before," she retorted, her voice sharp. "You did not protect me when I was marched up a mountain like an offering." "You did not protect Seth." "I was unaware," the sheriff conceded, "but I am now." She looked at Rourke, who remained motionless. "She deserves her peace," he said. "She has earned it." The sheriff nodded. "I will leave you with the decision, but if she comes to town, she can help ensure this does not happen to another girl." He departed, leaving behind the necessary documents, with no demands, no threats, only an expectant silence. That night, June remained speechless for hours. Hope slept soundly, nestled against her. Seth watched her from across the room, possessing an understanding far beyond his years. "Do you want to go?" Rourke finally inquired. "I don't know." He waited. "I want to help," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I am afraid. Afraid that if I see him again, I won't be strong enough. Afraid I will revert to the girl I once was." "You won't," he assured her. "You couldn't even if you tried. That girl is gone. You are someone else now." She looked up at him. "Who?" "Someone braver than I," he replied, "and I have witnessed the aftermath of war." She departed 3 days later, not alone. Rourke accompanied her. Seth remained behind to care for Hope, displaying a quiet fortitude, a shotgun resting across his lap. Bram met them partway, guiding them towards the town. The courthouse was modest in size but filled with a palpable atmosphere. The other girls were present, some older, some younger than herself, each bearing a name once inscribed in that damning ledger. June stepped forward and recounted her ordeal. She did not weep, she did not falter. She spoke of how her father had sold her, how Wilkes had sanctioned it, and how she had been dispatched to a man in the mountains to be eradicated. Then she shared how she had survived, how she had found family, and how she had discovered her freedom. The assembled crowd remained motionless at first, but by the conclusion of her narrative, tears flowed freely. Wilkes was declared a wanted fugitive across 3 states. Her father was apprehended. Not a single person stepped forward to offer a defense for him. June returned home transformed, not broken or diminished, but more complete. She kissed Hope's forehead, whispering, "Your mama did what she had to do." And Rourke took her hand, murmuring, "And now you never have to again." The air on the mountain felt different, no longer just colder, but somehow purer, sharper with each breath, as if something in the very soil had shifted, releasing the last vestiges of pain that had been buried with the previous year's snows. June walked with a more measured pace in those days, not due to physical frailty, but because she had learned to cease her hurried passage through moments she had once believed she would never survive. There was a profound peace in the quiet intervals between her footfalls. The wind no longer whispered warnings, it carried gentle lullabies. Hope toddled through the fallen leaves with the air of a monarch surveying her domain, her small boots scattering gold and crimson, her laughter echoing against the distant trees. Seth followed in her wake, no longer the frightened boy who once hid behind crates, but a steady young man who understood the responsibility of protecting someone he cherished. He did not need to be asked to watch over her. It was an instinct, as if he had been born with the knowledge. June stood in the cabin doorway, arms crossed over a woolen shawl, observing her children, noting their inherent belonging in this place. It was evident that nothing here appeared borrowed any longer. The cabin was more than mere shelter. It was theirs, constructed with effort, deliberate choice, and love. It had borne witness to their grief and their healing. Rourke stepped up behind her, his hand a comforting presence on her back. "The cold is coming early," he murmured. June leaned her head against his chest, nodding. "I feel it, but we are prepared." They were indeed prepared. Inside, displayed above the fireplace, were the names Rourke had carved, one for each of them: June, Seth, Hope, and even Bram. Though the old man now resided further down the mountain, still stubborn and kind, a neighbor who never needed to be asked twice. He would sometimes bring sugar and always brought stories. That winter was distinct, not easier, but imbued with a lighter spirit. There were nights when the wind howled like a wild creature outside, and they would huddle close around the fire, sipping mugs of tea and sharing tales. Rourke crafted a cradle for Hope, its corners adorned with etched foxes and owls. June created a quilt, her fingers finally steady enough for intricate stitching. Seth learned the art of trapping rabbits and skinning them. Each time he returned with a successful catch, his chest puffed out a little more. And there were days, even in the heart of the freeze, when June would step outside and no longer feel hunted, when no shadow would make her flinch, when she could close her eyes and simply exist. Spring arrived sooner than anticipated. The first signs of green emerged in the crocuses near the stones, followed by the rising birch sap, and suddenly the woods seemed to awaken in unison. Hope celebrated her second birthday, her voice more boisterous than thunder. Bram ascended the mountain bearing a basket of preserved peaches and a whittled horse for her, its form rough but clearly imbued with love. She shrieked with delight, dragging it behind her wherever she went. Their celebration included honey cakes, wildflower crowns, and Seth playing a somewhat off-key melody on a banjo that Bram had repaired. June did not cry that day. She had no need to. Everything she held dear was gathered around her, and for the first time she felt no obligation to offer her happiness as a sacrifice for past pain. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear, June sat on the porch with Rourke. Hope slept peacefully inside, curled beside Seth, both lost in their dreams. "Do you ever consider," she whispered, "that all of this originated from something intended to shatter us?" Rourke paused before responding. "Then things only break you if you allow them to. You did not. You yielded, you cried out, but you kept moving forward." "I almost didn't," she confessed softly. "But you did," he replied, "and that is what truly matters." June turned her head, her gaze meeting his. "What about you? What sustained you before me?" He averted his gaze, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line as if searching for spectres from his past. "A matter of routine," I surmised, "or perhaps a burden of guilt. Then, one fateful day, you arrived, brought to my remote dwelling like a decreed retribution. Yet you became the very force that shattered the oppressive quietude." She gently caressed his weathered cheek. "You were my salvation," he inclined his head. "We were each other's deliverance." That summer, news arrived via courier of her father's demise within the confines of the correctional facility. No formal ceremony, no parting words, merely an official notification and the unspoken acknowledgement of his interment in an unmarked, forgotten plot. That evening, June stood beside the flowing water, the document clutched in her hand, and allowed the breeze to snatch it from her grasp. She shed no tears. She uttered no curses. She simply relinquished it. Later that night, she confided in Raw, "He is gone." He responded with a nod. "That chapter of your life has concluded, then?" "Yes," she affirmed softly, "it has." The subsequent years unfolded with a tranquil rhythm. Hope blossomed with vibrant intensity. Seth matured into a man, possessing a quiet disposition akin to Rourke, yet endowed with a keener intellect. At 17 years of age, he departed to collaborate with Bram in the lower regions, but he returned monthly, bringing provisions and literature, his laughter resonating with a newfound exuberance. He commenced penning correspondence, lengthy missives, and June meticulously preserved each one, folding them neatly within the old tea receptacle positioned near the hearth. Rourke's beard first yielded to the silvering of age, followed by his hair. Though his physical strength remained undiminished, his movements grew more deliberate, his joints protesting the encroaching chill. June would playfully tease him about it. He, in turn, would refer to her as trouble, a familiar endearment which always elicited a smile from her. They never ventured from their mountain abode, not even when neighbours extended invitations to town for the annual harvest festivals or local markets. Their universe was contained within these familiar surroundings. The arduous path that once led her to this elevated terrain in subjugation had transformed into a promenade she traversed with unburdened freedom, accompanied by the effervescent spirit of hope, joyfully identifying the flora and fauna she knew intimately. One autumnal morning, as the foliage began its descent and the air carried the mingled aromas of wood smoke and decaying leaves, June awakened at an early hour. Rourke was already attired, seated at the table, his gaze unfocused. "Are you well?" she inquired. He responded with a slow nod, indicating he had experienced a dream. "Regarding what?" "Your father," he stated, his voice subdued. "He stood at the precipice of the ridge, utterly silent, simply observing me." June was awaiting. "I believe I have achieved forgiveness for him," Raw confessed after a pause. "Not because he merited it, but because I wish to cease harbouring his presence within my very being." June acknowledged his sentiment. "You are not obligated to carry the weight of his actions." "I do not," he agreed. "I carry you, my hope, within this dwelling. That suffices." She extended her hand across the table, clasping his. His grip remained firm, undeniably his own. That winter, Rourke fell ill. It was not an abrupt decline, merely a persistent cough and a pervasive weariness in his limbs. He resisted naturally, attempting to chop firewood as if unaffected, but June perceived the truth. And one night, as he lay in bed, too feeble to sit upright, June nestled beside him, resting her head against his chest. "You bestowed everything upon me," she whispered. "No," he rasped. "You granted me purpose." Tears welled in her eyes, and she allowed them to flow. "I do not wish for you to depart." "I will not," he breathed. "I will remain in the very planks beneath us, within the sheltering trees, in the joyous exclamations of that young girl. You will find me everywhere." And indeed she did. His passing was serene, a gentle release, free from any trace of anguish on his countenance, replaced by an earned tranquillity. They laid him to rest behind the cabin, beneath the spruce tree where he habitually etched carvings. Seth returned home and mourned openly, kneeling beside the grave. Hope initially struggled to comprehend, but when she placed the carved fox atop the earth and declared, "Papa is asleep now," June understood that the child would eventually recall him through affection, not through a sense of void. Years later, after Hope had blossomed into adulthood and Seth had established his own family, June continued to reside on the mountain, her hair a cascade of silver, her hands roughened by years of labor, yet her spirit remained unblemished. The official record that once classified her as chattel had long since disintegrated within some courthouse archive. No one spoke of Wilkes or her father any longer, yet they spoke of June, the girl who had been bartered like livestock, the woman who had stood in a courtroom and irrevocably altered legislation with her unvarnished truth, the matriarch who nurtured her offspring not with apprehension, but with a profound and unconditional love. And occasionally, when the wind whispered just so, and the stars blazed brightly above their dwelling, she would settle onto the porch and close her eyes. The mountain seemed to resonate beneath her feet, and she felt his presence beside her once more, not as a source of sorrow, but as a cherished remembrance of all they had painstakingly constructed from the remnants of devastation. From subjugation emerged purpose, from fear a family was forged, from suffering peace was attained, and that peace she had truly unequivocally earned.